we have a very, very large audience. Islington iU3A is very arts-oriented, which is a good thing, as you're the Professor of History of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Courtop. We can't get much better than that, can we? She's particularly interested in 20th and 21st century art and in the international context. She was given, she said I should say Knight of Arts and Letters to French art and culture, because I was a little anxious about my pronunciation of Chevalier. But maybe that will do. Chevalier des Arts. Sarah Wilson, over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, everybody. I was delighted when Helen Perkins, my long You can't hear. I thought this was switched on. Do you want me to put on this one too? Sorry. Should we put on this one too? I think I have to just press the button. Is this better? No. Is this better? No. All right, so I think we need to adjust something so I can hear. Does somebody who knows what to do this one to
Derek's on again. Derek's on again.
Make it, sorry, you will make it louder. Sorry.
1, 2, 1.
Yes.
1, 2, 1. Everybody now. 1, 2, 1. Very participatory. I'm going to show you some performance, but not you still can't hear. If I speak very loudly, with perfectly loud speaking voice, I'm perfectly prepared to do this. Can you hear now?
It's stand up.
Hear your face. Does Derek want to
We're just
Is
checking.
this mic any better?
No.
Near your face. What about that? What, is this better if I speak with... I can hear myself, I can hear it reverberating now. That's okay. All right, off we go. So, as I said, I'm a long-standing friend of Helen Perkins. We go right back to our school days, as I will reveal in my lecture. And I'm extremely happy to be invited to speak to you. I'm of course not going to give you a conventional how to understand Cubism or whatever lecture, nor am I going to give you an introduction to the wonders of the Courtauld Institute of Art Galleries or anything like that. My lecture is far more autobiographical and more surprising. I presume among you there may be people who are interested in the visual arts, who are gallery goers, who go to our wonderful museums in London, but also people who don't. Obviously, it was interesting and not difficult, but a challenge for me to think of how to do this. And I'd also like to say a lot of the artists whose names I'm going to mention, including some which have to be pronounced more or less with a French accent, you won't have heard of, and it would have taken me about another 8 hours to actually transcribe all the titles and dates and everything and put them under each slide, which you wouldn't have absorbed anyway, because I'm going to go quite fast. So I just want to say that when you're interested in something, if you're giving a question, you can say the one with the little bird on his head or whatever to me, or the pigeon with the dynamite on his back is more accurate. I'm going to show you a pigeon with dynamite on his back. Just say that one. And of course, if you are interested, you can both look at my website, which I'm trying to update at the moment, where lots of my texts are available. And you could pursue things. So I'm very happy to do that afterwards, but I'm not going to actually, do the kind of dates and the things and so forth as if I were giving a lecture to undergraduates who've got to remember things and be examined on them. So why did I call art history the beautiful game? Obviously, as it's occurred to me, I have actually written about a Polish football hooligan turned artist called Marcin Dudek, who is exhibiting at the moment in a gallery run by one of my former students in London. But actually, I'm not going to talk about football, as you may have fathomed. It's because all my life, all my professional life, has been devoted to art history, which is a subject I discovered almost serendipitously And for me, I genuinely do believe it's the most beautiful game. In the past, in the distant past, all the brightest and the best in literae humaniores or greats, Latin or Greek at Oxford or whatever. And I do believe not only has art history as a discipline replaced that in the 20th century in terms of its breadth, in terms of the widest possible and most multidisciplinary humanities discipline, but also it's the most fun. Now I'm, as you will discover, I am at this moment, do I want to actually sit down and write a book called Adventures in Art History, or do I want to continue with my adventures? Because with my students, I've had, and without my students as well, with professional people in my circuit, I've had the most wonderful adventures, and in fact every new text, my most recent one, for example, being about a Hungarian conceptual artist, which has led me to Debrecen in Hungary, to Berlin to interview him. Each one has been both an intellectual adventure and the discovery of a remarkable person. So these are my students. In fact, they're going to pop up again. They seem to be the most photogenic group I ever had in 2009, with me in the middle holding the tiger, the subjects of his paintings, not his most important paintings, is my very dear friend, the late artist Jacques Monori, who lives outside Paris, holding a tiger. Next to him is little Ning Huang, who runs an art gallery in Kyoto. Gemma Rolls-Bentley, who's very much involved in queer art and its institutions in London. Behind her, Amanda, who always wanted to marry the most charismatic and important policeman in France, which she managed to do. I think he's in the peace hierarchy. Natalia Siljekovic now runs the most, she's the most responsible young curator in the new museum in Warsaw for modern and contemporary art. Elizaveta Butakova, half Siberian, whose PhD I supervised and taught my MA for a term last October when I was on sabbatical, and I took her with my MA students to the Manifesto exhibition in Kosovo, an amazing adventure, 2 days, 2 nights, and Jacopo Galimberti. We always have a little bit of gender imbalance in our subject, not at museum director level, of course, who is now teaching in Venice, in the Faculty of Art and Architecture in Venice, who's published 2 books about avant-garde groups, mostly male revolutionary groups where art and politics were inextricably mixed in the 1970s. So we go right back to my childhood days with Helen before we were split up when I moved somewhere else when I was 13. And I just wanted to recall to Helen, I don't know if she remembers this, the most amazing week in my North London experience when our form teacher was ill. We had one lecture in chemistry where we made yellow paint out of chemicals and painted daffodils. We had one lecture where we learned the Greek alphabet and had to write it down. And the third, we were taken out of our junior school, somewhere around the back in modernist buildings, to the old house, and someone explained to us about Greek capitals and columns, and how here we had Corinthian columns stuck on this, in fact, 18th century old house, which had come from acanthus leaves, and which had first been used to decorate the columns on Greek temples. This is something, that whole week, I've never forgotten. But I was more the kind of girl who read at the time, some of you will remember this, the series called I was Girl with a Pen. I wanted to read English literature. I went off to Oxford, I sang, and I was in theatre with Helen, opera, all sorts of things, but still not this wonderful word art history, which I suddenly heard about. However, something very, very important, which I will come back to, happened in a vacation in Oxford. The first I went to Florence, the second Venice, the third Rome, on my little mini, very, very economically challenged grand tour. But in Venice, when I was doing churches with my friend, I saw that there was the Venice Biennale on in the Giardini, this biennial exhibition, and I went into it. That particular year, it was extraordinarily political. It was about, I didn't know at the time, of course, it was about Spanish protest art after the fall of General Franco, because Franco had just died. It was about torture in Chile. It was about all these things, which actually, in my little haven of academia, I had not the faintest idea about. And there was a lot of abstract art. I always, and still do, alas, talk too much. And I was completely dumbfounded. And I realised that by no way was I in the centre of the intellectual universe. There was this big world where art wasn't art appreciation, it was engagement with political issues. It attracted huge crowds. It attracted international forums and people making the most extraordinary things I had no grip on at all. Including, for example, in the English Pavilion, which I can't even remember, and I'm going to end my lecture with him, Richard Long, 682 stones in a line going blong, blong, blong all through the pavilion, which I've completely forgotten about. So, you know, what was this universe? And that's why I applied to be called, I forgot that we also had this fabulous, at North London, separate art building and faculty. And while Helen will remember, I remember these old boards, they hadn't changed when we were there. The person who taught us, of course I had no idea about this rather scary old lady, but actually she was an artist who'd been to Moscow in the 30s, who was a friend of Eric Ravilius, who actually used all her wisdom about patterns and pattern making to make for us extraordinary stained glass windows at Christmas and Easter where every single child participated. So although at the time I was still leaning towards the literary world, where I chose, incidentally, I forgot to say, the most extravagant and gory things, I think, to get away from my ordinary life. So I really specialise in things like Jacobean tragedy at Oxford. This new world for me was just so extraordinary. So I ended up at the Courtauld Institute of Art. This is our old home designed by Robert Adam in Portman Square, with this wonderful inside, now alas a private club, which has been, its inside has been really diminished with little frills and furbelows. I don't know if any of you belong to it. But what is interesting is that there, and again, one learns these historically important things afterwards, always in retrospect. There was a little plaque saying that it had been founded in 1932 by Samuel Courtauld. In fact, it was his wife who was the arty one, and he was the man with the checkbook after his long history in textiles and rayon and becoming a millionaire. It was founded in 1932, so just to put two issues I want to point out. 1933, Hitler comes to power. And of course, all the Austrian and Viennese and German great art historians managed to come to London in the 1930s. Gombrich and everybody else you've heard about. And the Warburg Institute was founded, moving from Frankfurt because of this at that time. So London was really the hub. But the important thing to point out to you, whether novices or not, is that there were two strands that kind of fused and also showed the liberality of the Courtauld at this moment of birth and transition. And that is the long tradition in England of the grand tour and aristocrats buying things when they went to Italy to make their stately homes all over the country. And the idea of connoisseurship, and which drawing is better than which drawing, and which drawing is by an old master and which is a follower. So the tradition of connoisseurship, and if you like, antiquarianism, and looking formally at things, came together with the more German discipline evolved in the 19th century of what's called Kunstgeschichte, which was a history of art much more involved with history and social practice and so forth. Bizarrely enough, the so-called social history of art was sort of reinvented in the late 80s, when in fact it had been there all the time. And great post-war art historians like Friedrich Antal and Klingender came from that German Marxist tradition and were very much on the go in the 50s. So I was taught by John Golding, who is here on the right in this portrait by Ron Kittai, it's either called Friends, or it's called In London, James Joll and John Golding. And he's wearing a little blue smock, just like Helen and I used to wear for our art lessons. In fact, it was very astonishing for me to see this, because for me he was the great author of the first important scholarly book on Cubism. But he, at the time, people were very, very cagey in those days, let alone people like Anthony Blunt, as you know, one of our directors who was a Soviet spy. John Golding was extraordinarily cagey, both about his life, his partner James Joel, and the fact that he was a painter and was teaching simultaneously at the Royal College of Art. It's very extraordinary. He never brought the two groups of students together, for example. And his painting, as you might see if you were into such things, is very much affected by the abstract expressionism of Mark Rothko, with its fuzziness and the way you could interject into the fuzzy areas and see one area over the top of others and things. So this was the hidden John Golding. We didn't know at the time, but he did indeed teach us abstract expressionism, which for me was a great revelation. Although one of the things I want to show you, I'm not going to give you a lecture on abstract expressionism, is this painting by Arshile Gorky, done in 1944, which is very splodgy. You can't quite see what it is. It has biomorphic forms, forms relating to life forms, curves, full of trickles, very thin paint. But the title is, remember, at the time he was an American abstract expressionist. He's actually an Armenian immigrant to America. And the title of this painting was How My Mother's Embroidered Apron Unfolds in My Life. So to literary me, this was extraordinary, the juxtaposition of the title, How My Mother's Embroidered Apron Unfolds in My Life, and what that implied, and the formal lessons about trickling paint and influences from Kandinsky, who had a retrospective at that time in the MoMA and so forth. It was very, very interesting, because right from the very beginning I'd had to make the transition between words and images, and the way that one is speaking about images which are dumb in words and so forth. Then I discovered, this is a kind of flick forward, but just to show you, one of the painters I'm quite interested in a Hungarian emigre in Paris called Simon Antai, who actually folded his canvases up into little scrunches and then dyed them in all sorts of different ways. He did more tie-dye-ish things then, and I think, relating to the people I see in front of me, you will remember tie-dye. You'll actually see, if you look at this picture of his mother, her pleated apron. It's actually true. I just love this juxtaposition. So this, you see again how my mother's pleated apron unfolds in my life. A very interesting introduction to an otherwise intractably difficult Hungarian painter in France in the 1970s. But I think you see how actually this was indeed once a part of this lecture is based on another one which was called, I can't remember, it was biographical about me, and it was called Unorthodox Art Histories. I'm actually sometimes, of course, a very good girl, but I'm quite a bad girl sometimes in terms of being interested in things that aren't just the straight story, and that's probably because of this literary background I inherited. So the next big move for me was to the Centre Georges Pompidou, leaving Gothic Oxford and 18th century Robert Adam interiors for something much, much more challenging, related to Archigram in London in the 60s, Richard Rogers, incredible interior spaces, and at the time the new technologies of free photocopiers, electric typewriters, in which I had to type on a French keyboard, which I still do. And you can see there an exhibition about Cubism. So these big movements still go on, and if you're really interested in art history, it's interesting to get your head around them. Together with another Hungarian immigrant, Victor Vasarely, whose sort of psychedelic work you all actually know, but you don't know that you know. But I know that you do know, because I did quite a long time ago. So unlike the people who've had very disillusioning stories to do with their professional lives in the Pompidou Centre, I'm a complete idealist, and every time I go up the escalator to Bibliothèque Kandinsky, I get an absolute thrill. And there I was invited, much to my astonishment, because I'd only just done my MA, I was only like 23 or 4, to work on one of the big 5 exhibitions, because when it opened, it tried to compete with the Museum of Modern Art in New York in a retrospective way, doing things that the MoMA was incapable of doing. And it began not only with the Marcel Duchamp exhibition saying this guy is ours, but then Paris, New York, Paris, Berlin, Paris, Moscow, realisms, and last but not least, Paris, Paris. But if you look at the dates, you'll see it's 1937 to 1957, which sounds very sonorous. But in fact, this disguises the real dates, which are 1936, Spanish Civil War, to 1958, the accession of General de Gaulle in the middle of the Algerian War. And it covers the period of the occupation and the whole hoo-ha about the French Communist Party. Now, all the curators with their busy jobs didn't want to have anything to do with these rather nasty and sticky situations, and for some extraordinary reason, the moment that changed my life, the very handsome curator here, you can see on the left, a few years later, Germain Viat, he gave me the job. Of course, I got very good credentials and everything, and he read my MA, but he gave me the job of working on those absolutely awful bits. I think Robert Whatnot had written, Robert Paxson had written his book about Vichy by then. But there was nothing that had been put together. It was really working from documents to put together chronologies and things. And of course, my adventures were not confined just to Paris, because for that I not only met these extraordinary communist artists I befriended for a very long time until their deaths, but on a secret trip, which was never in the newspapers, Germain Viat and I went to Cologne and Dusseldorf, and we met Hitler's sculptor Arno Breker. And you can see here, because this monograph is notionally written by the great French 1930 sculptor Charles Despiau, this is one of the documents of collaboration. And Breker was given a huge retrospective in the Orangerie at the very moment when people were being whisked away to concentration camps in occupied Paris. And it was very strange because we met him as an old man. And unbelievably enough, you can see at the bottom that Ludwig, as in the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, by this time had commissioned this guy to do very, very bad, corny portraits with perm and all of him and his wife to go in the foyer of the Ludwig Museum. So obviously this interest, of course it was also because I'd done German in my second school and I could read all the German periodicals that were coming out in France at the time. And I was like the German link to speaking to him in this interview. But I mean, I had these extraordinary experiences with people who then subsequently died. So another man who really marked my life, but for many, many, many decades, because he didn't die until 2005, and I still stay in his apartment when I go to Paris, thanks to his daughter, is Boris Tazlitsky. Tazlitsky was from an immigrant family who came to Paris from Russia, escaping both the Russian Revolution of 1905 and, of course, anti-Semitic pogroms. And long story, his father died fighting for France in the First World War. He became my close friend, but I brought actually the little pamphlet, well, it wasn't exactly a pamphlet, the study, one of my most successful things on the internet, of Amrita Shergill, because Amrita Shergill is like the Frida Kahlo of India. But when she was at these, and she was half Hungarian, her mother was a Hungarian opera singer, her father was one of, this photo is taken by him, he was one of India's first photographers and a great Indologist. They came to Paris, and they were both the outsiders at the School of Fine Art and had a great unconsummated love affair that was very, very important for Tazlitsky. So she painted these, and all these paintings are in the National Gallery in Delhi. And I once bought a photocopy of a painting that a colour photocopy of a painting she'd made of Boris's mother from the National Gallery in Delhi to Boris, you know, about 20 years ago. And he couldn't believe that this little English girl could bring him this colour photocopy of a painting from Delhi. You know that the Indian Embassy is just opposite Somerset House, where we were. So it's an extraordinary story, but he became the most important painter of the Holocaust in France, which of course was a very, very dreadful thing in terms of the French deportation. And what is more, he discovered in the middle of his own story, escaping things, being in the resistance, escaping, being captured again, being sent to Buchenwald. And he didn't do his big Buchenwald painting till 1945, but he discovered that his own mother died in Auschwitz. I'm going to a very major Holocaust conference, in fact, in October. This is a painting done from imagination. This is just a little small watercolour of it, of his It's the death of the wife of the French Communist Party arts policy person in Auschwitz in 1950. This is after the event, but of course it became a theme that he repeated and repeated and repeated. And it was very extraordinary for me as a kind of 24-year-old with my jolly madrigal singing in Inglet and then a little bit of courtauld impressionism to abstract expressionism experience, to speak to somebody who'd had these experiences. So of course my art historical trajectory, if you like, was extraordinarily informed by these encounters I could never have anticipated with most extraordinary people. And of course, at this time, I mean, you know about English literature if you read the supplements. This is why I understood that truth was far stranger and more interesting and more astonishing in every way than fiction. And I mean, the precursors on the Inglet scene is incessant Bloomsbury in the papers, as you all know, including now the Courtauld Gallery, because they don't have to pay copyright. The whole of the Courtauld New Cafe is Bloomsbury, Bloomsbury, Bloomsbury. We all know what Bloomsbury's about. Margaret Drabble, you know, Ian McEwan. It's all about domestic dramas and traumas of middle-class English people, which are generally, not in terms of many people's individual trajectories, but so dreadful and nothing to do with these intellectual challenges that I was experiencing. These are the portraits that Boris made himself in that tradition of making portraits of ateliers and pictures of his own atelier, which I've pointed over so many years. At the top, oh, I see it. I didn't see this. The screen is cutting off the top of the paint. Well, anyway, I'm just going to show you the picture of that little person sitting on a lap there. Oh, there you are. So this is a woman called Mireille Miaille, who actually went with him on she was also Jewish, incidentally, but they went in the time of the colonial troubles just before the Algerian War broke out on a reportage about poverty and things in Algeria. And because she was a woman, she could go into all the spaces that only women were allowed into. And actually, when I wrote on Taslitsky for his major retrospective, which has only just happened last year in Roubaix, where his enormous big painting of Buchenwald was shown, there is now in this decolonializing every discipline art history, questions about the trajectory from Holocaust and Holocaust frames of discussion into colonial persecution. And of course I was extraordinarily astonished when I discovered that on the 8th of May, France celebrates victory over the Nazis, Victoire sur les Nazis, on the 8th of May, which is the very day that soldiers massacred 4,000 people in Sétif in Algeria, French soldiers, for having a sort of a rebellion in terms of liberty, having served in the war. So the intersection of the colonial issue with the Holocaust issue is something very important that people are only just starting to address. Of course, our dear friend Pablo Picasso, who produced the most important political painting of the 1930s, Guernica, was still very much on the go. And he himself painted a painting shown while Boris was elaborating his big Buchenwald painting in 1945 in a thing called Art and Resistance, called Le Charnier, it's called the Charnel House. Charnel House is the English translation which you see in the MoMA in New York, which means nothing because it's a kind of Jacobean term, where in fact it's to do with ditches full of bodies. But this is a very bizarre still life you can see at the top. And at the time, the Communist Party in France staged this debate, Picasso or Taslitsky. Do you want the witness statement by the person who was there, who's realist, or do you want the great artist doing something stylized? And of course, because Picasso joined the Communist Party, this was a debate which was about art, which didn't really go away. I teach a huge Cold War course which elaborates this, in a very, in ways beyond that particular debate. But that debate really sums it up. Because of the adventure of modern art already having established its giants like Picasso, and the fact, can this painting convey what a realist painting would convey too? This is what the debate was all about. But one of the characters, and you may have seen this really bizarre painting in Tate, thanks to me incidentally, the largest painting in Tate modern and one of the most popular, but it's very incomprehensible. Because one of the artists who was very involved with this, the kind of the party really promoted a double whammy of artists, and André Fougeron, which is like being called Andrew Smith, not Boris Teslitsky, Andrew Smith, who went down the mines and did mining paintings and all sorts of things. He'd suddenly thought by the 50s he'd got to change his style. In fact, this is an amazing painting, which is a precursor of pop art, with this great, it's a hugely anti-American painting. I can't give you the whole iconography now, but it's like NATO headquarters. I didn't understand when he said to me "OTAN" all the time, which is, you know how the French say NATO. NATO headquarters, adverts for parachutists to go and fight in the Indo-Chinese war, coffins coming back, Indonesian mother weeping, French mother weeping over French coffin, arms race at the expense of pensioners, huge great American car, horrible American sniper in it, horrible electric chair because the Rosenbergs had just been electrocuted for being involved in spying on the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer fans. I was wanting to hear us a little bit about the Rosenbergs in Oppenheimer, but I didn't. And so what's interesting is this is a cinema screen sized history painting. People think, oh yes, Delacroix, Géricault's are after the Medusa. They don't really understand that this went on and on because in France there were these salons and the press came to the salons and people talked about these, and to make a splash you had to do this. But Stalin had just died while this painting was being painted, and the Communist Party were in disarray. This was the end of their realist policy. Too long to explain. But also bear in mind that, of course, the abstractionists went on, and they thought that they were morally right. And with, like Victor Vasarely, you saw the ad for him on the Pompidou Centre, speaking Mr. Psychedelia. And, of course, one of the pleasures is also reading all these lovely old periodicals. This one has got a painting by a follower of Matisse. You can see in terms of Matisse colours, but geometrical forms, called Auguste Herbin on the front. So, hopping over much of my life, I was able to curate with Norman Rosenthal, Paris Capital of the Arts at the Royal Academy, for which they chose the most horrible, dingy catalogue cover, which could have been this incredible orange square with a photogenic green woman going by Marcel Reiss on the cover. But obviously the PR people wanted a little recognisable Eiffel Tower. Why was it called Capital of the Arts? You'll remember here Norman Rosenthal's great exhibitions, German art of the 20th century, British art of the 20th century, Italian art of the 20th century. Why can't you do French art of the 20th century? Because of course most of it wasn't French. It was all the people who were flocking from all over the world, the Russians, the Poles after the First World War, the so-called School of Paris. And after the Second World War, which is what I'm most interested in now, people have got this stupid idea that the art world passed from Paris to New York. And there's a book by a French emigre called How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. Of course it didn't. All the anti-Franco people, the person who curated that Venice Biennale retrospective of Spanish art against Franco, they were all in Paris. And so that's what I'm rather interested in at the moment, including the Haitian painting Hervé Telemaque, who was recently at the Serpentine. So Paris Capital of the Arts was on the cut, it went up to 68, so there was a lot of French revolutionary stuff in it I'm not going to talk about. But technologically, I'm going to talk about this a tiny bit. It was going into people like Nicolas Chauffeur, another Hungarian emigre, but who actually created, was into cybernetics. This is like the great change in disciplines and in military technology. Norbert Wiener, Cybernetics, 1948, after the war, and created, this is a drawing, it's just rather spectacular, the cybernetic tower in Liège, which in 2016, after 40 years of not working, has been made functional again, which has got flashing lights, contemporary music, magnetic this, that and the other, wind thermometers, and other bits and bobs. So go to Liège and see that. And so on this cusp, this is 61, things are changing. You can't just do painting and sculpture. And we're not going into performance much in this lecture until the end. But this is looking forward to some of the exhibitions at the Pompidou that after I got my job, I then experienced. So after cybernetics, we're getting into the computer age. And at the very moment when France did have the most magnificent Minister of Culture, Jacques Lang, and a gigantic budget, unlike England, after, of course, the great André Malraux, whose family, after his death, work became friends of mine, there was this exhibition where they commissioned the philosopher Jean-François Lyotard, the man who wrote the book called La Condition Postmoderne, the postmodern condition, in 1979, translated 1984. They asked him to curate an exhibition about art and technology on the cusp of what it was not already called the digital age, but on the cusp of PCs. And they gave to people who intervened in this, like other philosophers, like Jacques Derrida and other thinkers, which France rejoices in and, you know, cherishes and doesn't fear the word intellectual, gave them the first PC so they could actually improvise and make communal texts together. And this is a work, obviously it's not computerized, but it's a work by the Greek artist Tarkis, which is involving magnetism and electricity. And the exhibition was called The Immaterials. And people are so interested in this absolutely threshold exhibition. And of course, it was a bit like the Venice Biennale, because I wasn't working on the show this time. In fact, in my head, Lyotard was a name who lived in California or something. I didn't realize he'd come back to France. I was like a tourist. I had like 2 hours. I went into this thing and I couldn't see where I was going. It was interesting for me that all the headphones were all in French, which obviously meant that most visitors couldn't understand it either. But I didn't really get it and I got lost in it. But now it's such an important exhibition. There's an exhibition about it at the Pompidou Centre, which I'm going to take my students to in November. So the immaterials, art on the verge of everything dissolving into the immaterial world or the digital age. And bizarrely enough, after that, and so I was just going to say as well, I nearly cut this slide out, but my dear friend Jacques Monnery, I began my thing with, he went with Lyotard to Death Valley and to these enormous satellite installations. This is the cover of one of those great periodicals that's called Behind the Mirror. And actually, I like this, and I've written a very long kind of Kantian article, trying to be a philosophical article about it. When they went there, I remember going back to school days with Helen, doing prime numbers, sort of sitting on my granny's knee and trying to express the fact that prime numbers were to the power of 1 and not the power of 10. Okay, you may have had that too. So Lyotard, in the desert with this, he suddenly realizes, and he quotes Baudelaire in The Dead Light of Stars in what he writes, he suddenly realizes that light from dead stars is hitting satellite dishes, but it's not just sort of magically transformed into a television image in the age of television. It's being transformed into a digital code of on, off, on, off, on, off. And this was the moment which I'm so interested in, which is not what people writing about postmodernism write about. But this is the moment when he got it, when he realized he also was in a digitally organized library, which was very different from the old Bibliothèque Nationale. So this is when the philosopher really understood, in conjunction with the artist, who then did these photo-based images, what was happening, which led to Les Immatériaux. And rather than the periodical I just showed you, which was all about abstract abstract art in general, geometric or a little bit more wobbly, a series came out then, and this is really the period I'm interested in, where you can see there's a one on contemporary music, there's one on conceptual art, which I now teach. This is this incredible moment of the late 60s, early 70s all over the world. And there's one, this is by The Sun, incidentally, the cover's The Son of Victor Vasarely, called, I can't remember, it begins with Y. This one says La Théorie. Now you may have heard that all the humanities are infested, or at least people think infested or infected by what's called theory. And I'm very anti students being given just photocopies or in nowadays PDFs of theory. And there are two things about theory. One is to understand how the thinkers evolved certain things, and one is called the toolbox approach. And the idea is that you can use theory and tart up what you're doing with it, but actually the evolution of ideas. And I thought that theory was not actually turned into a kind of noun like la théorie until I was pretty long when I discovered this number in the periodical, very important for the preface of my sequel to my book I haven't written. So this is what's important. It comes out in this context of conceptual art, the dematerialization of art, of contemporary music, and all these other things. And so that's what is really, really interesting, I think, and what is very different from giving people PDFs and telling them to read Michel Foucault. I'm interested in how these people got to that point of creativity in the late 60s, early 70s, which brought all this together. So bizarrely enough, because you'd think it would be before, but no, after Les Immatériaux, after the Immaterial exhibition in '89, came one of the most famous ones called Magicians of the Earth, Magiciens de la Terre, which was trying to break the canon of cubism, da-da-da. If you like art, you might have bought Thames and Hudson's Concepts of Modern Art, which is never revised, which goes Fauvism, Cubism, Surrealism, Minimalism, Conceptual Art, Art Today. It doesn't have this expanded canon, which put Richard Long, his mud prints of the Avon Valley River, on top of things made on the spot by Aborigine artists and native Australian artists, and which put together a whole spectrum of things. And the bogeyman was William Rubin, who curated this primitivism in 20th century art a few years previously at the MoMA, doing the conventional thing of putting here the mask with the Picasso. Of course, Picasso was interested in quiet African masks, not this particular one. But even though he's actually got the inverted commas around the word, as you can see on the title, this idea of contemporary artists and primitive art and Picasso being inspired by African masks wouldn't work anymore. So this exploded canon is what then is now the precursor to decolonial practices, or whatever you want to say, in our discipline. So back to my jolly crowd, because my big adventure, which started at the Pompidou Centre, who'd just done Paris-Moscow, is when I went to Moscow with them in 1981, before the end of the Soviet Union. And when I discovered that one of my contemporaries was taking people to the Havana Biennale, not just to Paris or Bruges, I said, well, I'm jolly well going to go to Moscow. So until December, just before the war in February 22, December 21, I used to take my students as often as possible to Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is extremely interesting. And there is, I mentioned Lyotard and this idea of the postmodern, which is a word I'm sure you all remember and know, and the postmodern condition. Basically, Americans who think that, well, think they rule the roost artistically speaking still, there's an American genealogy of postmodernism, but the one that comes from people like Lyotard, which takes on board things like the Holocaust and takes on board before really other things, takes on board the post-Soviet condition, is very interesting and much, much richer, and that's what I've always been teaching. And so my MAs at this stage were not, I did one that was used to be called Art in France 1945 to 68, Art and Intellectual Revolution in France 1958 to whatever. Then it became Pomo-Poco, Postmodernism and Post-Communism in Europe and beyond. So these were my Pomo-Poco generation. I didn't invent the term. But you can see we're in the snow, in the Park of Exhibitions in Russia, with a wonderful artist who took us and showed us the most extraordinary things in his apartment in our winter coats, the same crowd. Jeremy Epstein, there on the left, is the one who's the gallerist, Adel Asante now, who's showing Marcin Dudek, the explosive football hooligan. He's the one on the left. I don't know why he wasn't in the other picture. So this Soviet adventure began. Now, obviously, sometimes you might find contemporary art very confusing, and so do we. So once upon a time, I haven't been looking at my my little notes, have I? I can't see where I've got it. I just tried to find the date. In 2000 and... Oh, I didn't put it down. Anyway, in something like 2003, there was an exhibition at the Jeux de Paume in Paris called The Other Half of Europe. And this is when, of course, long after the anniversary of Magicien, 1999, 10 years after the war, because that 1989 moment was the fall of the wall, as well as the Magicians of the Earth show. After that, on the cusp, I think it was 2003, The Other Half of Europe. So I stepped into the Jeux de Paume, and I saw all this mud and these planks. So of course, you haven't ever got to feel inadequate if you don't know what the hell something about. It was not explained on the label either. I'm now friends with the artist. Shall I tell you what this is about, this mud on the floor and these planks, post-Soviet-wise? It's a very deliberate tongue-in-cheek that would have been got by everybody when it was first shown in Moscow, to this extremely famous Khrushchev-era painting called Wedding at Tomorrow Street, showing how Khrushchev is so kind in buying beautiful skyscrapers, building beautiful skyscrapers for newlyweds who are so excited at this new dawn in the thaw period that they're actually treading over the planks to their new future. So this installation, this is just to show you about something intractable and incomprehensible, right? So, and it shows you as well that all artists, whether you're Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Picasso or whatever, they have repertoires behind them. And knowing the repertoire and making jokes about the repertoire with your audience is part of the beautiful game. Okay, so mud, which nearly caused a flood and did some terrible damage to the Jeu de Paume floor, in Paris, completely incomprehensible, and Wedding on Tomorrow Street. So do you see how you can get things? And it's actually quite, it's part of the fun and part of the adventure to get them. Now this artist, Dmitry Gutov, whom I embraced, he always wears orange, and that's me. Let's go on to him. He always wears orange. He embraced me at the opening of the VAC Foundation in Moscow in December 2021. And we were all kissing everyone. And VAC's Victoria, she was my student, Victoria Mickelson. I didn't really know where her father's money came from. Oh, see you next time. We'll go out to dinner next time. I said, we'll go out to dinner next time on your next trip, to everybody. And now 30 years of the texture and enterprise and goodwill and excitement and exchange with Europe. You know, I organised a conference called Watch Out the Cominterns about, for example, the Courtal. All that is gone. Now, Dmitry Gutov is a very great fan, which went into his conceptual art installations, of an art theorist called Mikhail Lifshitz in Russia, who did a book in 1968 called The Crisis of Ugliness. And it was thanks to the fact that this old Marxist, who's one of the first people to write a book called Marxism and Art in 1935 in Russia, thought that American art was, you know, evil and contaminating, just like the Russians said about American cybernetics before they started copying it, after they copied the bomb. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong way around. They actually, Mikhail Lifshitz, saying, this is the crisis of ugliness, reproduced lots of Warhols. Andy Warhol. Even non-art people know Andy Warhol.